right, let's dive into this book, Output Focused Reading. It's by Katsuyuki Bito. I think a lot of our listeners are going to find this interesting, especially if you're like me, always trying to find ways to read more, read better, and actually remember what we read.
Yeah, and especially these days with just so much information coming at us from every direction, it can be tough to really absorb and remember everything we read.
It really can. So this book basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it suggests that we need to be more active with our reading, right? We need to be able to output the information in some way.
Exactly. That's the core concept here. It's not enough to just passively take in the words. We have to engage with the material if we really want it to stick.
Output. So what does that actually look like? What are some examples of output when it comes to reading?
Well, it could be a lot of things, explaining what you've read to someone else, maybe you're writing a summary, trying to actually use the information in your work, even just talking about it with a friend. All those things are forms of output.
So it's like taking those ideas and making them real, making them part of your world, not just letting them sit there on a page. Makes sense.
Right. You have to make it your own. And it's interesting because Beto himself, he reads like 1,000 books a year and he writes 400 book reviews.
Whoa, 1,000 books a year. That's incredible. So he's definitely walking the walk.
He is. He really embodies this whole idea of input and output. He's constantly taking in information and then putting it back out there in a new form.
Now I got to ask, does he have any secret techniques or tips for making the most of this output and making sure the information sticks? Because I'm all ears if he does.
He does, actually. He has some interesting ideas. One of the more unusual ones is something he calls the one-third reading method.
1/3. So you just read like the first third of the page and then move on? I mean, how do you get the full picture that way?
I know it sounds strange, but hear me out. It's based on the idea that our brains are really good at predicting and filling in gaps. So if you focus on the left third of the page, your brain can actually kind of predict what the rest of the sentence or paragraph is going to say.
Interesting. Is there any evidence to back this up? It sounds a little out there.
Well, there's this phenomenon called typoglycemia, where you can still read a sentence even if the middle letters of the words are jumbled. Our brains are just wired to fill in those gaps based on context. Bito's method is kind of tapping into that natural ability.
So he's hacking our brains to read faster. I like it. But wouldn't you still miss some important details? What about those times when you need to really dive deep into the material?
You bring up a good point. I think this method is probably better suited for certain types of material, like if you're just trying to get a general overview of a topic or you're reading something that's fairly straightforward. But for more complex subjects, you might need a more immersive approach.
Makes sense. So it's about choosing the right tool for the job. I can definitely see the value in that. But even with these techniques, I still struggle with remembering information after a while. It's like it just fades away. Any advice on that front?
Oh, absolutely. He actually talks a lot about active reading, things like highlighting, underlining, taking notes in the margins. Have you ever noticed how you tend to remember more when you do that?
For sure. I'm a big highlighter myself. I love to mark up my books. I feel like it helps me have a conversation with the author, and it definitely helps me to remember the points later on.
That's exactly it. He encourages people to really treat their books as a canvas for their thoughts. You can underline key phrases, write summaries in our own words, jot down questions. It turns reading into this dynamic process, not just passive absorption.
I love that analogy. A canvas for your thoughts. It makes the whole experience more, I don't know, personal and engaging.
And when you go back to review the material, it's like having a personalized study guide right there in the book itself.
All right, so we're highlighting, we're taking notes, we're maybe even trying out this 1/3 method. But let's be real, finding the time to actually read with everything else going on, it can be a challenge. Does Beto offer any practical tips on that front?
You might be surprised by what he suggests. He actually recommends using a kitchen timer.
Wait, what? A kitchen timer? For reading, I've never heard that one before. How does that work?
It's about creating a sense of urgency and focus. So you set the timer maybe for 25 minutes and you just commit to reading with complete concentration during that time. It's amazing how much you can get done when you have that clear time constraint.
Like a mini sprint for your brain.
Exactly. And there's actually some science behind it, too. When we're under a bit of pressure, our brains release norepinephrine, which can actually help us focus and learn better.
So we're not just being efficient with our time, we're also giving our brains a boost. I like that. A lot to think about here. But before we move on, I'm curious, does he have any advice on how to actually choose the right books to read? Because sometimes I feel overwhelmed by all the choices out there.
He does touch on that, and it's interesting because he doesn't tell you what to read, but he talks about the importance of being intentional with your reading choices. Like, before you even open a book, he says you should ask yourself, what do I want to get out of this? What's my purpose?
So it's about being more mindful about what we choose to read, rather than just grabbing whatever's trending or whatever everyone else is talking about.
Yeah, and he also gives you permission to put a book down if it's not grabbing you. It's your reading time, so you should spend it on things that you actually enjoy and that you're going to learn from.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And it actually leads nicely into something else I wanted to ask you about. I'm really liking this idea of being more intentional with our reading choices. It's like we're taking back control of our learning journey.
It is, and it's empowering, isn't it? You get to decide what you want to focus on, what knowledge you want to build. It's not about following some external list or trend.
Exactly. Now, I'm a bit old-fashioned. I have to admit, I love the feel of a physical book. Does Beto have anything to say about that whole digital versus physical book debate?
He does. He acknowledges the convenience of ebooks, of course, but he also points out some interesting advantages to physical books, especially when it comes to things like comprehension and retention.
Hmm, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, studies have shown that, the actual physical experience of holding a book, turning the pages, even making annotations, it can really enhance engagement and memory.
I can see that. With physical books, it feels more, I don't know, real, like you're really present with the material.
Right. It's not just words on a screen. And then there's the whole visual aspect. With a physical book, you can easily flip back and forth, see the structure of the book as a whole, revisit your highlights. It's like creating a mental map.
And those visual cues can really help with memory, too. I've noticed that myself.
Absolutely. They act as triggers, helping you recall information more easily. It's like those little breadcrumbs leading you back to the key ideas.
All right, so we've got the physical books, we're highlighting, we're taking notes. Beto seems to be suggesting that if we combine all these techniques, we can actually increase our reading volume without sacrificing comprehension. Is he suggesting we can read a book in like 10 minutes?
Well, he does make that claim, but it's not about speed reading in the traditional sense where you're just trying to skim through the text as fast as possible. It's more about reading strategically, using those focused bursts of attention, actively engaging with the material. It's like he's giving you a system for maximizing your reading time.
So it's not just about going faster, it's about being smarter with how we read. But even then, I still find that I forget a lot of what I read after a while. Any advice on how to combat that?
He talks about something called spaced repetition, which is basically the idea that revisiting information at certain intervals helps you remember it better in the long run.
So it's not a one and done kind of thing. You need to keep coming back to the material to really make it stick.
Exactly. He suggests, creating a system for revisiting key concepts maybe a week later, then a month later, and so on. And you can do that in different ways. You can use flashcards, summarize the main points in your own words, even teach the concepts to someone else.
I find that just talking about what I've read with a friend helps me remember it better. It's like having to explain it out loud forces me to really understand it.
That's a perfect example of output in action. And it brings in that social element of learning, which can be so powerful. When we share our knowledge with others, it reinforces our own understanding and it can spark new insights and perspectives.
It's definitely more fun to learn together, that's for sure. Okay, before we wrap up, I have a question for you and for listeners to think about too. Imagine you could go back in time and give your younger self one piece of advice about reading. What would it be?
Ooh, that's a good one. It really makes you think about all the things you've learned along the way. What about you? What advice would you give your younger self?
That's tough. I think I would tell myself to be more patient with my reading, not to feel like I have to rush through everything, and to really savor the process, because reading can be such a joyful and enriching experience. But sometimes I forget that.
I love that. And, it reminds me of something else Baito talks about, cultivating curiosity. He says that the best readers are the ones who approach every book with a sense of wonder, a desire to learn and explore. And that's something we can all do no matter what we're reading.
That's a great point. And it really speaks to the power of lifelong learning. It's not about getting to some end point. It's about the journey itself. And I think that's a perfect note to end on for today. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, lots of great techniques for getting the most out of our reading. But now I'm thinking, okay, how do we actually put all of this into practice? It's one thing to talk about it, but how do we make it work in our real lives?
Yeah, that's the key, isn't it? I think the first thing is to remember there's no one right way to do this. Baito offers all these different tools and techniques, but it's really about finding what works best for you, what fits your learning style, your goals, your preferences.
So kind of like a personalized reading toolkit. We can pick and choose the tools that work best for us.
Exactly. Experiment a little bit. See what resonates with you. Maybe the 1/3 method is your thing. Maybe it's not. Maybe you're all about the highlighting and note-taking. It's about figuring out what helps you learn and remember best.
That makes sense. But how do we decide which technique to use for which book? Is there a way to, like, match the tool to the task?
Well, I think a lot of it goes back to what Beto said about purpose. Before you even start reading, ask yourself, why am I reading this book? What do you want to get out of it?
Right, so it's like setting an intention for your reading.
Exactly. And when we know your purpose, you can choose the tools and techniques that will help you achieve it. If you're just reading for pleasure, maybe you don't need to go all in on the active reading strategies. But if you're reading to learn something specific, then you'll want to be more engaged.
Makes sense. Now, even with the best intentions, sometimes it's hard to stay focused when you're reading. Life gets in the way, distractions pop up. Any advice on how to create a more conducive reading environment?
Beto talks about the importance of having a dedicated reading space, even if it's just a corner of your room, somewhere you can go to minimize distractions and really immerse yourself in the book.
I like that little reading sanctuary. And maybe some noise-canceling headphones, too.
Exactly. Whatever helps you create that sense of focus and calm. It's also helpful to let the people around you know that you need some uninterrupted reading time.
Oh, yeah, good point. Set those boundaries. Okay, let's loop back to this idea of output for a second. Beto's a big advocate for writing book summaries, but he also says we should think beyond the traditional essay format. So what are some other ways we can put this principle of output into practice?
There's so many options. You could try creating mind maps, recording audio notes, summarizing the key takeaways. You could even just talk to yourself, like explain the concepts out loud as if you were teaching someone else.
Haha, I love that. Just have a conversation with yourself about the book. Actually, that's not a bad idea. It would definitely force me to think through the concepts more deeply.
Right. And you don't even need an audience. Just the act of articulating the ideas can help solidify them in your mind.
Okay, so we're near the end of our deep dive here, and I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder. Imagine you could go back in time and give your younger self one piece of advice about reading. What would it be?
That's a great question to reflect on, isn't it? It really makes you think about all the things you've learned along the way. What about you? What advice would you give your younger self?
Hmm, tough one. I think I'd tell myself to worry less about how much I'm reading and focus more on how I'm reading. It's not a race, it's about quality over quantity. And to really enjoy the process, because when you're engaged and curious, learning becomes a joy, not a chore.
I love that. And it makes me think about something else Beto talks about. He says the best readers are the ones who are always learning, always growing. They're not afraid to ask questions, to challenge their assumptions, to explore new ideas. And that's something we can all strive for no matter where we are on our reading journey.
That's a great point to end on. Reading is a journey, not a destination. And it's a journey we can all take together. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into output-focused reading. We hope you've gleaned some valuable insights, and we encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those pages turning. And as always, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, your own moments, your own reading adventures with us. Let's keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. Happy reading, everyone.